Conservancy's continuing Determining Decade Town Hall series with California public policy leaders. We greatly appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us for this discussion. I think you will emerge today with a better understanding of where Californians are, where we are as a state versus the rest of the country, and what Californians are thinking about, what the challenges are in the public policy environment today. And I am really excited to have Dave Metz, a principal at the FM3 Public Opinion Consulting Research firm. They are a national leader in public opinion polling. They have been an active partner with the Nature Conservancy over the past 20 years, really. And we have together worked on statewide conservation measures that have delivered some $20 billion, that's with a B, $20 billion in conservation investments as partners with the Nature Conservancy, working to find measures that drive support for environmental investments. And FM3 has just been an incredible, thoughtful partner in this effort. And I am really excited to have Dave Metz joining us today. A little bit about this Determining Decade series that I want to share with you. The Nature Conservancy is in 79 countries around the world. We are active in all 50 states across the country, and Dave has a great perspective on that as well. We also, in our work, have protected 120 million acres of land for nature and across the world, 173 million acres of critical ocean habitat. In California alone, we have protected more than 1.5 million acres for public enjoyment and for nature, and 3.8 million acres of ocean area habitat. And our work here is dynamic. We are active in the public policy environment. I do want to thank our board, our volunteer leadership, our incredible team of dedicated conservation professionals doing work across the state that are joining us for this discussion today. I want to note the tab at the bottom of your screen is a place where you can participate in this discussion, provide questions for Dave Metz and or me to address in this dialogue today. I will be joined by Liz Forsberg, our Associate Director of Policy, who's going to be handling your questions and taking those into play for our consideration in the discussion today. So I am excited to have Dave Metz with us today. Dave earned his bachelor's in public policy from Harvard University, his master's in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley. Dave is a Californian. He resides in Berkeley with his family, 2 children, and he is an incredibly dedicated professional. We have had, again, just a great pleasure of working with Dave over the years. We are actively working with him now in a climate resilience bond that the Nature Conservancy has been working on to increase investments in how we respond to the challenges of climate change around us. With that, Dave, let me welcome you to our webcast today. How are you doing out there?
I'm doing great, Jay. Thanks very much for the chance to be with you.
Great, great. Well, thanks for joining us. I mean, these are really challenging times as we get started here, Dave. I think every day we all wake up with this new sense of what's the uncertainty of the coronavirus bringing around us. What is that like for you as a pollster? I mean, this just feels like a time of unprecedented volatility as we think about just the challenges that people confront in their day-to-day lives, as well as what we're seeing, across the country. I mean, what's that like as a pollster?
Well, it's sort of a double-edged sword for pollsters. On the one hand, you're right that there's a lot of volatility to public opinion, and part of our job is to sample what the public thinks today and try to make some projections about how they're going to vote in the next election or where public opinion may be going. And we always have to tell our clients that any poll is just a snapshot of that moment in time, and obviously is subject to change. But this year, that is more true than it has ever been in 2 decades of my doing this work. The swings in public opinion that we've seen on key issues over the span of a couple months or even a couple weeks have really been dramatic. On the other hand, there's a very small silver lining for pollsters in that while for the last decade or so we've been struggling with getting people to respond to polls, we've seen response rates falling. During the pandemic, actually, response rates to polls have gone up. We obviously have more people who are at home, and people have strong opinions about what's going on and some eagerness to share them. And so we've actually found it easier to get people on the phone and have a conversation with them. And in some cases, it goes on longer than we even need it to. So it's sort of been a mixed bag from a polling perspective.
Well, as we've talked a bit ahead of this discussion today, you've been pretty busy looking at different dimensions of the coronavirus response challenge. I'm curious, what are Californians thinking now? I mean, what are their key concerns, and how has some of that landscape shifted, or how is it shifting around us?
Yeah. Well, a couple general trends that we've been noting. First is that we've seen more of a sort of positive feeling about the direction of the state over the course of the last couple of months, which is a little interesting and perhaps counterintuitive. One of the first questions pollsters usually ask in polls is whether people think things in their state are headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track. And for the last year or two, the numbers in California had been getting more negative, with persistent concerns about homelessness and the cost of living, cost of housing in particular. Californians were getting more and more dissatisfied with how things were going. But since the start of the pandemic, there's been, I think, a heightened feeling of community solidarity, that all of us as Californians are facing some of these same challenges, and we've seen more positive sentiments about the direction of the state. We've also seen increases of 10 to 15 points in people's favorable feelings toward the governor and toward local elected officials, largely based on their responses to the pandemic. But we've also looked at the way that people's opinions about some of the key issues facing the state has shifted. And I think here we can take a look at some of the data we've gathered. If we can take a look at the slide deck. On slide 1, here you'll see a list of a range of issues facing California. And this is a poll that we did for TNC about a month and a half ago, where we asked people to rate how serious a problem they thought a variety of issues facing California were. And what this data shows is that there's a range of new issues that have obviously moved up the list here. The proportion of people who are concerned about the economic and health impacts of the coronavirus is more than 3/4 of those polled. But at the same time, the list of issues that were concerning California previously, things like the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, or the risk of wildfires, are undiminished. They still are things that Californians recognize as problems, and the presence of the virus hasn't made them go away. I also want you to note toward the bottom of this slide, second from the bottom, you'll see climate change. 62% of Californians rate that as a very serious problem. We'll come back and talk about some of the dynamics around climate a little bit later. But the next slide shows you how some of these opinions have shifted over the course of the last couple of years. And in particular, we have roughly a year-to-year comparison in the columns for May 2019 and April 2020, where you'll see the proportion of Californians who label themselves concerned about each of these issues. There's been a dramatic jump in the proportion who are concerned about unemployment, not surprisingly. But when it comes to a range of other issues, including conservation issues, that concern has largely held steady from year to year. And we've seen this in a number of polls, both in California and nationally.
Yeah, I think looking at some of the concerns that we're seeing in the news today, certainly the unemployment numbers are not surprising. But what other factors have been that has the pandemic brought about in terms of public attitudes, directly thinking about coronavirus and how we respond to that?
Yeah, well, it is obviously the driving factor in people's perspectives, not just about the public health threat that it poses, but how they think about the economy, how they think about the cost of living. It's affected views of education and the role of public schools. It really has a wide range of impacts. And so understanding how the public feels about these different pieces is really critical to trying to understand how opinion on other issues may shift. And in California, the numbers we've been seeing are pretty close to what we've seen nationally. On this next slide, you'll see a question where we ask people whether they think that the worst of the pandemic is over or that the worst is yet to come. And by a 20-point margin, Californians believe the worst is yet to come. A solid majority hold that view. And this is a poll from, I think, just about a week ago. So this is very recent data. And you'll see those numbers relatively closely mirror what national research is showing. Now, when they think about what the worst may be, there's obviously different dimensions to it. You'll see on the next slide a question where we ask people to evaluate their level of concern that they or a close family member will get sick from the coronavirus. 45% label themselves extremely or very concerned, while a slight majority say they're only somewhat or not too concerned. Now, this number has been trending up over the course of the last couple of weeks as the virus has sort of resurged in California. But one of the distressing developments we've seen is that perspectives on this issue have become deeply partisan. If you look on the table to the right-hand side, you'll see the first column shows the subgroups of California's electorate that are most likely to say that they're concerned about getting sick, and those on the right-hand side, those that are least concerned about getting sick. And it is essentially a left-right divide. This dynamic has been true in national polling and in polling in other states as well. Now, aside from getting sick, the other major factor, of course, is the economic impacts of the virus, and you'll see those detailed on the next slide. When we ask people whether they thinking about their own personal financial situation, if they're confident or uneasy that they will be able to meet their living expenses. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see we've got 68% of voters that tell us they are confident they'll be able to meet their living expenses, while a little more than 1/4 are uneasy. But this is among the voting population, which is a little bit more affluent and financially secure than Californians at large. To the left, you'll see data from a survey we conducted back in April among Californians of color and those with household incomes under $50,000 per year. And a very different picture emerges. For that segment of Californians, even back in April, a majority were uneasy about their finances. And what the data has shown us is that in the months since, that anxiety has increased rather than diminished. So right now, there are certain segments of the California electorate where this is a very deep source of anxiety. And if the recession continues as it's expected to, that's likely to spread.
I want to just take a moment to welcome those that may have joined us a couple of minutes late here. Please do look at the tab bar at the bottom of your screen. It has a spot where you can provide a question in the queue. My colleague Liz Forsberg will be working through those. And again, we do thank you for taking moments out of your busy day to join us for this discussion with one of the country's leading pollsters, David Metz of FM3 public opinion research firm based in here in California. Dave, I want to think about this, and I do feel like we're all learning day to day how to cope with the challenges of the coronavirus in our work, in our social lives, every aspect of our life, really. Here at the Nature Conservancy, that work is really very much focused on conservation and climate change. Do you see any signals out there that the concern about the coronavirus and the pandemic are crowding out voters' interest, voter support for investments in dealing with climate change? How does that look in California in particular?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. That certainly was a fear that we had at the start of the pandemic, is that issue would sort of overwhelm people's ability to focus on issues relating to conservation, and in particular, their willingness to support public investment to address them. But what the data has shown us so far, very encouragingly, is that Californians, and I think this has also been true in most other parts of the country where we've polled recently, are showing undiminished support for making investments in conservation and addressing climate change. You mentioned that we've been doing some research for you in California exploring the feasibility of a climate resilience bond. And that allowed us to ask some questions pre and post pandemic that sort of had a very specific example of the kinds of investments we're talking about. If you'll skip ahead 2 slides to slide 9, you'll see here data that shows the degree to which Californians perceive a need for additional funding for flood protection, wildlife habitat, and wildfire threat reduction. And when we asked that question in May 2019, 79% saw at least some need. A year later, this April, in the midst of the pandemic, the number was 73%.
And these really are the categories that we're working on together in driving this climate resilience bond. Really, it's about this bigger mosaic of protecting Californians in the face of increased wildfire threat, sea level rise, floods, and water scarcity. But these are, of course, the values that we're looking for conservation investments in the state, which are hard to come by. So I think it's heartening to me, for sure, to see the resilience of support in this. Dave, is that a similar dynamic across the country? Is California unique in that respect?
Yeah, so in the last couple of months, we've done polling for your colleagues for the Nature Conservancy in New York, in Vermont, in Hawaii. We're in the field of the poll right now, about to launch one in Michigan and in New Jersey. And across all these states, which granted do trend a little bit bluer, we've seen very similar dynamics. Undiminished levels of concern about climate change and its impacts and conservation issues, and then strong willingness to support action on these issues as well. So California is not unique. I think the conservation ethic that's a little more broadly shared here than in some parts of the country may mean the numbers are a little bit higher, both previously and now. But the consistency of support has held true in a lot of different regions.
Mm-hmm. So what can we learn from many of those other places? I think turning to New York may be particularly instructive, right? They're looking at a measure kind of aligned with where we've been headed for the last couple of years in the state. And let's take a look at what you're seeing there.
Yeah, so if we skip ahead to slide 11, we recently put a survey, slide 12. We recently put a survey in the field in New York, which was designed specifically to understand how to message about conservation and climate change in a post-COVID environment. New York was hit earlier and harder than most other parts of the country. It's the one place I've polled where more voters tell us they believe the worst is over, as opposed to the worst being yet to come. The numbers are kind of the converse of California. But that means that the electorate there is in a place where they can look forward and see a future and think about where we're headed. And so we wanted to ask some questions about how they think about conservation in that context. And one of those questions offered people the choice of two statements that you'll see on this slide, which is essentially, we should look at this moment as an opportunity to rethink the way our economy and society are structured and plan to move forward to address challenges in a different way, or we should strive to just get back to where we were and sort of the way we were living pre-pandemic. And by an overwhelming margin, more than 70% of New Yorkers are telling us, no, this is an opportunity to rethink things. And that's encouraging. It suggests that people are willing to step back and perhaps be open to some more fundamental changes. Even when we explicitly reference climate change, which we do with some caution because we know it's such a deeply polarizing issue along partisan lines that there's a set of voters who will sometimes shut down when we invoke that issue. Wasn't the case in New York. We could mention it specifically or not, and we still got this overwhelming endorsement of sort of taking a new direction. As we do that, as you'll see on the next slide, we also wanted to understand how people felt about the role of science in guiding the decisions we make. Obviously, the Nature Conservancy as an organization is guided by science in all of its actions, and our response to the pandemic has had to be guided by science as well. But there's been a debate about the role of science. Certainly some people have been skeptical and thought that scientists either didn't anticipate the severity of the problem, weren't able to model what would happen, or encouraged us to impose limits on social activities that might have been more dramatic than what were needed. And so we asked people to choose in New York between two statements assessing the role of science. And by a 2-to-1 margin, what they told us was that their confidence in science has increased as a result of what they've seen in the pandemic. Only about 1 in 3 are telling us, no, I'm less confident in scientists now. Now, the challenge here is this issue, like many others, is partisan. Democrats are vastly more likely, as you'll see on the right-hand side, to say that their confidence in scientists has increased, while Republicans are evenly split on this issue between saying that they feel more and less confident in the role of science.
Does that trend worry you over time?
It does. And this is obviously not the first time that we've seen this sort of partisan split about the role of scientific expertise. In issues around climate change, it's been a a subject of debate and discussion for a long time. And so I think to some extent, discussion of the pandemic is being sort of shoehorned into an ideological divide that already existed. But to the extent that at least for the left and the center of the electorate, it seems to be reinforcing instincts that we need to be guided by science, that's obviously an encouraging development.
Right.
We also had a couple of other things we looked at in New York that I think are worth noting. One had to do with the amount of time that people spend outside. And what we've seen is, you'll see on the next slide, is that since the start of the pandemic, if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, about half of New Yorkers said they were spending less time outdoors. Only about 1 in 5 said they were spending more time outdoors. But when we asked them to think ahead to once stay-at-home restrictions are lifted and indicate whether they would spend more time than they previously had outdoors or less time doing so, by a margin of 3 to 1, they said, yes, I want to spend more time outdoors. And that's more time outdoors than they were spending pre-pandemic. So what this is telling us is that there is a lot of anxiety people feel about being cooped up inside, and perhaps an increased appreciation of opportunities to spend time in nature. This is particularly true for lower income households, communities of color, and residents of New York City itself. And so I think that tells us, and obviously those are some of the folks whose access to nature probably has been most curtailed by virtue of geography. So again, this speaks to another potential opportunity to really sort of capitalize on some pent-up demand for appreciating nature in person. One other aspect to note here comes on the issue of climate change. And as you'll see on the next slide, we asked our respondents to think about whether our experience with the coronavirus has lessons that are relevant for how we address climate change. It also is a very predictable threat to both public health and our economy. And thinking about perhaps our lack of preparation for the virus might lead us to think about how we can take actions now to prepare for impacts that climate change might have. Another view might say these are two unrelated issues. And by a 51 to 42 margin, New Yorkers told us they believed that, yes, there were important lessons that could be drawn from the pandemic for how we handle climate change. Again, the issue was partisan, as you'll see on the right-hand side. Democrats more likely to say that there are connections, Republicans overwhelmingly rejecting that view, and independents somewhere in between. And I think some of this has to do with the already partisan nature of views of climate action, and then also the fact that the pandemic and the health response to it has started to fall into that same category. The final note from our New York data that I'd point to is on the next slide, where we tested a range of messages which build on arguments for conservation and climate action that we've seen be effective before, but tried to recast them in light of what we learned from our experience with the pandemic. And here you'll see the 3 most potent messages that we tested in New York, which align with a lot of the attitudinal data we've just discussed. The first message focusing on the lack of ability to spend time outdoors and the importance of being able to do so for physical and mental health as a rationale for increasing a focus on conservation. That was hugely compelling. It was the top testing message across virtually every subgroup of the New York electorate. Second, a message focused on equity. We've seen in New York, as we've seen in California, a broad recognition that both the pandemic and the economic impact that have come from it have disproportionately burdened communities of color and low-income communities. And therefore, as we think about a recovery, we need to very mindfully make investments that will address those inequities. And then finally, the last message there is one that just stresses this idea of a double bottom line, which we've seen be effective in conservation messaging before, but I think in economically challenging times gains added salience. And that's this notion that investing in actions to conserve nature and to prevent climate change can also, if done wisely, have the benefit of creating jobs and boosting our economy. And New Yorkers see both of those sets of benefits available, and we're enthusiastic about policies that held the promise of accomplishing those 2 goals together.
I'm glad you've raised this issue of social and racial inequity. It feels to me that there's an unprecedented moment here of recognition of a need for reconciliation in society and building bridges to truly create equal opportunity. It sounds like you're seeing that in the data here in California and in New York. Are you seeing it elsewhere as well?
Absolutely. Both the state and national polling is very consistent in showing broad recognition that deep inequities exist in our society, that the pandemic has exacerbated them rather than created them. A recognition, and this has come from polling we've done in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the protests that have followed. But both a majority of Americans and Californians believe that there are systemic problems, systemic racial inequities built into our criminal justice system, that it is not the result of actions of a few individual police officers, but that there are systemic things that need to be changed. And this has resulted in higher levels of concern about ethnic and racial disparities in society and broader levels of support for a wide range of policies to address them. Now, we've seen in the past that when we've had similar tragedies that have sort of highlighted these differences, Hurricane Katrina is one that comes to mind, that there's been a temporary bump in the polling for taking action to address them. But this moment feels different. By a 2-to-1 margin, Californians tell us they think that this is a moment that should inspire lasting change rather than temporary change. And because the effects of the pandemic and its economic impacts are not going away anytime soon, the spotlight that's been shown on these inequities, I think, is going to persist. Now, obviously, it's up to all of us to take action to sort of make real what the public is, now is asking to be done. But I do think there's an opportunity here that is somewhat unique to potentially have more lasting change.
I see we're getting a number of questions in the queue, and I do want to just remind folks that there's a tab on your screen to put your question in for Dave Metz or for me to respond to. Dave, as we tear into taking those questions, I want to turn back to slide 11. As you know, the Nature Conservancy has been working hard on a climate resilience bond. We started this out as an initiative more than 2 years ago. We got a pretty good signal from then Governor Brown and now Governor Newsom of interest in developing a climate resilience bond that addressed social equity, that really recognized that those that are most vulnerable to climate change are people that are living in underserved communities, that are on the margin economically as well. And we've really factored those things into this bond. I guess I have a twofold question for you as we get ready to take questions from the wider audience here, thinking about it. But you've been a vital part of this work, and we're very appreciative for your counsel. And where is the public? Because we need to meet them where they're at. It doesn't really matter what the legislature thinks on a bond should be spent on. If the voters don't vote for it, it doesn't happen. And so we've been very conscious about meeting people where they're at and addressing these concerns. On one level, as we've discussed over time and thinking about these conservation funding measures, times of economic volatility, and add to this one unprecedented social and volatility and concerns about racial equity and divisions in society, would seem to be a moment that we need to be cautious about bringing tax and bond funding measures to voters. But it seems like this measure is really bearing the test of a lot of turbulence out there, that it's viable today. And I guess I just want you to address that head on. I mean, on one level, we're really torn in this, incredibly volatile moment, but it seems like voters are ready to make these investments in climate resilience. What are you seeing out there?
I'm seeing the same dynamic. The fact that we are facing a pandemic does not mean that climate change has been suspended and that its impacts are on pause in any way. After going through, in the last 3 years, 2 of the most brutal fire seasons that Californians have experienced in recent memory, we're facing another year that's been relatively dry where fire risks are high. Californians understand that, and they know that the virus does nothing to mitigate that. We can't simply wish it away or say that it's something that's not important to us right now. And so when we talk about making investments to reduce wildfire risks, Californians are saying, yes, we have to do that. We have to address the virus, and we still have to address this problem. And interestingly, the question that we're highlighting here that you called out is one where, after we asked people whether they'd support the bond measure and found their support was undiminished compared to where it was in 2019, we said, what's the main reason you want to support it? Is it to address these substantive problems that the bond measure is designed to address around wildfires, water quality, flooding, and habitat protection? Or is it the notion that by investing billions of dollars in projects to address these issues, we're going to create jobs at a time when Californians need them most and stimulate the economy? And by an overwhelming margin, what voters are telling us is that no, the reason to make these investments is to deal with the persistent problems that have been there before. The economic benefits are great, but it's a secondary advantage of the bond rather than a central rationale to support it. Now, this is all very encouraging, but this is a moment where I have to go back to the caution that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, which is this is a snapshot of a moment in time. And it may well be that if the sort of economic downturn, it persists through the fall as we get to election day, the economic impacts work their way up the economic ladder, and more middle-class families that right now are feeling comfortable start to feel a higher sense of anxiety. That could shift. So we have to watch that dynamic very carefully. But what we're seeing so far is encouraging, and it suggests that Californians and most other Americans aren't backing away from the idea that these investments remain necessary.
And this is even at this moment where your data is showing that Californians expect the economic situation to get worse before it gets better.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I do want to take a moment also to thank our board, our volunteer leadership, our conservation professionals who are doing work across the state. And we're getting some questions across the queue that my colleague Liz Forsberg is sorting out here. Really appreciate that. Please jump in with your questions as well as you look at that bar. Let me turn now to Liz to get some of these questions in the mix for Dave. And Dave, thank you again for taking this time to join us and think about where Californians are at in this really, really incredibly interesting and volatile moment in our public dialogue. Liz?
Great, thanks Jay, and Dave, nice to see you today. We have a couple of questions on the trends that you were seeing on the COVID-19 response. So the first one is, do you have any idea why political party affiliation is associated with so many differences in people's responses?
Well, it's interesting. It was not the case at the start of the pandemic that there were partisan differences. In fact, there was a lot of partisan consistency in the way that people were responding at the very beginning. But over time, that has changed. And I think probably the strongest illustration of this that we see is views of wearing masks. That's a place where there is a deep partisan divide about its necessity. And that's something that's evolved over the course of the last couple of months. And it's driven by our political leadership. There are people of different parties that are making very different cases about the necessity of taking some of these actions to prevent the virus. And those messages are being received, and it's driven this partisan divide. The same thing happened on climate change. 15 years ago, it was a completely bipartisan issue, and it became partisan when the leadership of two political parties were actively advocating different kinds of responses. So I think really that's what's driven the numbers to go to a very different place. It's an unfortunate consequence, but now it's one that's, once you establish that polarization, it's very hard to reverse it.
Great, and building on that question, do we know if the divergent views of the coronavirus are along party lines is driven by federal messaging or affected by local and state messaging?
It's driven much more by federal messaging than it is by local and state. And California, I think, is a good example of this. And actually, we have a slide that I think speaks to this. It's 7 or 8, I believe, if we can put that back up. We asked Californians to indicate how they viewed the performance, slide 8, of a variety of different actors in their handling of the pandemic. And you'll see here, Californians offer overwhelming approval for the work of public health officials, the governor, their school district, state government overall. and overwhelming disapproval for the performance of the federal government. Now, some of this you might say is, well, California is a blue state. There's a lot more Democrats here than there are Republicans, and so that's what's driving it. But the national polling shows the same negative reaction to the federal response as well. And so I think some of that is what's driving things. You know, people who feel allied with the president sort of come to his defense and adopt some of his messaging. But the overall thrust of opinion here is really divisions about the role of the federal government, and even in red states, the response to how governors and local officials have handled it is generally as positive as what we're seeing here in California.
Right.
Great. Next question. Has there been any polling on how the pandemic has affected attitudes on personal behavior with respect to environmental issues? I'm concerned that people who feel that they have sacrificed to stop the spread of the virus will feel entitled to be more lax in other areas.
That is a really fascinating question. And I think it's having mentioned that, I'm going to think about some ways to formulate some questions that get at that. Because there's sort of two paths one could think. It's either, you know, I took action and in my state, it helped to slow the spread of the virus, and I feel rewarded for having done so. And so that's going to put me in a place where, when it comes to climate change, I'm going to be more conscious of the impacts that my actions have. On the other hand, you could have some people who say, I did everything I was supposed to, and the virus is still with us. It didn't go away. You know, it's sort of a learned helplessness dynamic, where they may say, individual action doesn't really matter in this context. You know, the data I've seen so far that touches on this suggests that more people are motivated to continue doing what they're doing than to back away from it. But again, that's another dynamic that may well shift over the months to come. So I think having some questions that get at that issue of, you know, do you feel like your personal actions, do you feel rewarded by them and encouraged to do more and in other domains, or do you feel discouraged? That fork in the road that people are facing is an interesting one to explore.
Dave, I'm curious, are you seeing a generational divide in response to this so far?
We're not seeing a huge one in response to the pandemic. Partisanship, much more than age, seems to be the dividing line. And granted, there's some correlation there. Younger voters tend to be a little bit more left-leaning, older voters a little bit more conservative. But the age divides haven't been stark. Certainly on the issue of climate change, there is a massive age divide. It is one of the issues that younger voters, especially those under 30, rank at the very top of their list of concerns, whereas for older voters, it's lower down.
I guess it's in this area of personal responsibility in particular that I'm just wondering anecdotally, it feels like I'm seeing more crowds of young people gathering and not paying as much attention to masks or safe social distancing. And, you know, maybe that's just me and what I'm seeing out there.
No, we certainly, you know, we've all seen the pictures on the news of the crowded beaches and dynamics like that. This is also one of those areas where there is a divergence between what people do and what they tell pollsters they do. And so, you know, one may know what the right thing is and say, well, yeah, I try to be really careful. And in practice, maybe the young people are a little bit less strict in their adherence to it, especially because, you know, the data so far has shown that, you know, younger people are facing less health risks, even if infected, not zero, but less. And so they may feel somewhat emboldened as a result of that. So again, that's another one to keep a close eye on.
Got it. Liz, let's turn back to your questions there.
Great. So turning to climate change, what trends have you seen with voters understanding conservation issues? Do voters have a good understanding of climate change and the impacts to California? And has this changed over time? And maybe we could put up slide 10 for this question.
Understanding of climate change and attitudes toward it are two different things. 2 decades is that most voters don't have a very good understanding of what climate change is, what causes it, what risks it poses, what actions we can take to address it. People will confuse greenhouse gas emissions with damage to the ozone layer, other kinds of air pollution. When you ask people what action they can take to fight climate change, there'll be a moment of stunned silence in a focus group, and then they'll say, well, we should recycle more. So a lot of the mechanics of how it works have remained fairly obscure to people, although over time there's been some increase. But where we've seen the biggest change is just in people's recognition of the threat that it poses. As I said a few moments ago, until the mid-2000s, it was seen as sort of a middle tier issue and one that wasn't terribly partisan. The moment things really changed was when An Inconvenient Truth came out in 2006. And at that point, there was a concerted effort in response to that documentary by some on the right to diminish the seriousness of the issue and the need for action. And that's when the partisan numbers really started to separate, and Republicans became much more dismissive, Democrats became much more supportive of action. And the collective impact was that the numbers nationally in terms of concern about climate change started going down because voters on the right and a little bit in the center were expressing less concern about it. That was true to a limited degree in California as well, but again, as a blue state, there just weren't as many Republicans to drive an overall shift. Now that trend continued pretty much unabated through the middle part of this decade, but over the last couple of years, both nationally and here in California, we've seen the trend reverse, and concern about climate change has been steadily rising. What seems to be driving it is the fact that the impacts of climate change are much more visible on the ground in ways that people are associating with climate change. More frequent and severe wildfires, more frequent and severe storms, more frequent and severe flooding. Obviously, even though no single event can be specifically tied to climate change, their increasing frequency and severity can. And the public does seem to understand that. And so we have larger and larger numbers of voters, and it's not just Democrats and independents, it's also Republicans who are saying, yes, this is real, and we need to do something about it. Now, support for what we can do in terms of either regulation or carbon pricing or investment in natural infrastructure varies a lot, and those are sort of complex policy solutions that don't lend themselves to sort of soundbite debates. And so progress has obviously been uneven there. But the numbers at this point are heading in the right direction, and we seem to be building a broader and broader public consensus for action, although obviously time is short for that action to have meaningful impact.
Yeah, I think I'd underscore in some of the states where where the Nature Conservancy has been active, we've started out with measures that we felt had a strong base of public support, and we've encountered opposition campaigns that have broke expenditure records in defeating smart climate long-term responses. A few years ago in the state of Washington, losing a measure that was putting a price on carbon. I guess, Dave, what did you see up there? I mean, where was the line where we began to kind of lose support for that measure? I mean, on some level, we're the underdog. We're not going to be able to spend the kind of money that industry can spend in these campaigns. But as you look back on that, what are the lessons that we take away from that campaign in particular, and bring to California maybe?
Well, in initiative campaigns, passing positive and complex policy change at the ballot is always difficult. It is much easier to move people to a no vote than it is to move them to a yes vote. The burden of proof is just much lower. Voters have an inherent skepticism of ballot measures. They think that they're going to have unintended and potentially negative consequences. And so when they get messages from a no campaign that confirm that suspicion, they tend to gravitate to it. In Washington, support for that measure was somewhere in the mid-50s to around 60%. It was a sort of a robust carbon pricing measure. But as you noted, the oil industry outspent supporters of the measure by a margin of about 3-to-1 in defeating it. And unfortunately, that kind of spending does have a significant impact, especially when there's sort of a lot of details of the measure that aren't intuitive for voters in terms of how it will work. Where we have had success at the ballot is when we're looking at mechanisms that are somewhat less complex than carbon pricing. Measures that increase renewable portfolio standards to have a shift in the electrical sector to more clean and renewable energy and away from energy generated by fossil fuels. Nevada passed one in 2018. In Michigan, the legislature agreed to an increase to avoid having a fight at the ballot. And those kinds of policies are a little easier to explain, a little more intuitive for voters, and sometimes can withstand opposition spending in that context. So a lot has to do, ultimately when you're talking about having success with a ballot measure, about the amount of resources each side has, and then how easy it is to explain the nature of the change that the measure is trying to accomplish.
Good. Liz, let me turn back to you for a couple more questions here as we've got a little more time.
Great. So a more broad question, what has been the most surprising trend that you have seen with your research during the pandemic?
I would say it's the more positive sentiment that we've seen from voters. I mentioned that sort of at the outset in looking at the California data. This is a really grumpy electorate, and it has been one for a while. The state's inability to the state and local government's inability to deal with these intractable problems around homelessness and housing costs, the cost of living, traffic congestion, really had people in a place where they were kind of cynical and despairing. And one would think that piling a pandemic and a recession on top of that might just drive voters into an even darker place. But what we have seen is this sort of refreshing sense that, yes, we're facing a challenge, but we have to get through it together. And our collective action in California has made a difference. People feel that by staying home and adhering to public health guidelines, they avoided the worst of the consequences that were projected, akin to what New York suffered. And so it's been really encouraging to see people maybe feeling a little more empowered, feeling a little bit more confident that we do have the ability within our hands to take this state in a more positive direction. Now the question is, how durable is that sentiment and how fragile is it? As we see case counts skyrocketing across many parts of the state, and as the economic sort of negative conditions persist, will people continue to feel that way? But it was very surprising to me that we sort of had that initial burst of positive sentiment that we had, and it does suggest that Californians are capable of seeing that there is a brighter potential path that we have ahead of us.
Good. Liz?
Great. Building on that, what trends are you seeing for the November election?
Well, the first thing I would note is interest in the election is off the charts. We have a question that we often ask in polls where we have people rate their level of interest in an election on a scale from 1 to 10. And in 2018, which you remember those midterms inspired a lot more interest than most midterms typically do, especially here in California, where there were a lot of competitive congressional seats, around 60% of people rated their interest a 10. In this year's election, 80% are rating their interest a 10. That's also about 20 points higher than what we saw in the 2016 November election. So people are really highly engaged. Obviously the outcomes of most races in California are not terribly uncertain, certainly not the partisan races. But one of the trends that I think bears some watching is voting by mail. California has made it very easy for people to vote by mail, has encouraged them to do so for a decade now, and many counties have already shifted to all voting by mail. Only about 15% of Californians vote in person at the polls.
Huh.
But obviously the governor has, and the legislature have approved a plan to have all of this election be a vote by mail election. So California will look like Oregon, like Washington, many of its neighbors that have already made this change. And that trend is something that we're seeing spread across the country as well. That shift could be really durable. It could be lasting, and it could have significant impacts on both voter turnout, potentially engaging more people to participate, and also, from the perspective of a pollster who works on campaigns, a lot of changes in the sort of the mechanics of how campaigns are run. And we're seeing right now a lot of interest from the public and a lot of support for voting by mail. So that's something to keep an eye on. and obviously, just in terms of other trends, you've all seen the national polling, which is reflected in our own polling as well, which is a dramatically widening margin for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, with the potential consequence that a lot of U.S. Senate races that look like they might be fairly safe ones for the Republicans are now deeply in question.
All right, Liz, why don't I give you one more, and then I've got a question for Dave here as we are nearing the end of our hour here.
Great. So one last question from our audience. Have you done any polling related to the likelihood of people to maintain new COVID-19 habits that might be more environmentally friendly? Specifically, the likelihood of continuing to work from home and minimizing travel times related to admissions.
Absolutely. We have asked some questions about that, not necessarily framing them as issues about conservation or the environment. But what we have seen is, as more people have been forced to work from home, we have a much larger group that say, I'd like to keep doing this. I hope that my business continues to make it possible for me to work from home. People have talked about how they've been able to avoid long commutes, spend less time in the car and more time with their family. And given if they have the infrastructure, reliable internet connections and computers to work from home, that's something that they find very appealing. In New York, we did test some messaging that tried to build on this and sort of explain to people the dramatic reduction in emissions, both of CO2 and other pollutants in New York as a result of the reduction in driving, and make the case that we ought to try to make it easier for people to not drive as a result of the success we've had over the last couple of months. And that was kind of a lukewarm message with the public. They found it persuasive, but not with the same intensity of some of the messages that I showed you earlier. The other factor that we really have to contend with here is people's belief or their concern about using public transit. Among a list of behaviors where we've asked people, how concerned would you be about resuming this activity after the pandemic? Using public transportation is the one where we see the highest level of concern. We saw that in New York, and we've seen that in some research we recently did here in Northern California as well. Just the notion that social distancing is very hard on a BART train for those of us in Northern California. You have to touch a lot of surfaces that other people have touched. There's some understandable health anxiety around that transit systems are really struggling with. But having people fully bought into using transit when they do need to travel as opposed to driving will be critical in building on some of the success we've seen in sort of getting people out of their cars in the last couple months. And so that dynamic is one that policymakers will really need to grapple with.
Right. I know we haven't been able to get through a number of these questions, Dave, so we will probably circle back with you and get answers for folks that are putting questions into the queue. I think what I'm hearing from you is there's a high level of personal anxiety about COVID and its presence, that people are expecting things to get worse before they get better. They're concerned about economic well-being, their own, and where the state is headed. But they're also resilient in terms of thinking about climate change, especially in California, especially in New York and some other states that are still considering ballot measures to bring to the November ballot. What other words of wisdom do you have for us? I mean, did I get that right? What am I missing? And it seems like I'm sensing a real optimism from you. I'm sensing that people are feeling like we are going to get through this, and we're going to embrace the future and the challenges it brings. And I guess what does TNC incorporate in our work to really make that real, bring it alive, connect with voters wherever they may be?
I think you've characterized it well. And I guess, sort of the advice I would offer is continue to be bold. Don't look at this moment and think that we need to trim our sails or that we need to go backward. Based on what the public is telling us, we don't. They not only recognize that the challenges we face from climate change and the importance of conservation haven't diminished. In many ways, there are segments of the electorate that tell us they, more than ever, understand the need to address them. And so there's a conventional wisdom that tells us we can't spend a lot of money, we can't try to do anything big or dramatic now, we need to kind of bunker down and retrench. we should resist that because there's not a lot of data telling us that that's where the public is. At the same time, internally, we also need to be cautious as we do that because things are so volatile. And where public opinion is today may not be where it is in 2 months or 4 months. And so we have to always sort of keep our eye on what may be changing. But we should look at this as a moment to press forward. Maybe with different arguments, maybe with different framings for why we're doing what we're doing. But we don't need to be hesitant. We don't need to retreat.
Words to live by. That's Dave, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to thank our volunteer leadership, our board, our conservation professionals that do this work across California. And I want to thank Dave Metz. I mean, together with FM3 as a critical partner, the Nature Conservancy has been a leader in delivering $15 billion of conservation investment, more than $20 billion of conservation investment measures at a state level in California in just the last 15 years. And we've doubled down on a number of local areas throughout the state. And Dave's really been just an incredible partner in helping us understand the public, understand what different voters need in this. And Dave, we're very appreciative for your work. We look forward to continuing to engage you. I'd like to bring you back again before the election, certainly, to talk again in our Determining Decade series. And we call it the Determining Decade because we really are running out of time to address the challenges of climate change before us. And we've really got to make these changes in a meaningful way on a policy level, on a funding prioritization, in action on the ground to address the challenges of climate change in concert with our conservation priorities, protecting clean water, protecting critical conservation lands and ocean habitat in the state. So I do want to thank again our volunteer leadership, our audience here for taking time out of your busy schedule. We're with you in these challenging times. We know it is a difficult moment in wrestling with the myriad challenges of coronavirus. We are going to take a couple of weeks this summer to kind of back off a little bit on our town hall series, and we'll be back with you in a few weeks. I wish all of you all of the best. In the months ahead, we will address the questions that we weren't able to get to today with Dave, and we'll get answers out to you folks that put those questions in front of us. And we'll also use that information to help us inform the polling. I enjoyed the dialogue with Dave today. It's very insightful for me to just hear the dynamism out there and the perseverance of Californians in embracing these challenges of the future and in recognizing the importance of addressing climate change and the environmental challenges before us. And to you, our donors, our volunteer leadership, friends of the Conservancy and our conservation professional team, thank you for making all of this possible. And we wish you well and be safe out there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.